Greetings and welcome everyone. Welcome to today's presentation titled Integrating Faith and Spirituality into Trauma Recovery, presented on behalf of Mental Health Recovery and sponsored by SAMHSA. My name is Kelly Maston from Nashville, and again, I'd like to welcome you today. This is our disclaimer, and again, we'd like to give special thanks to SAMHSA for allowing us to share this information with you today. Oops, I'm sorry. Today's webinar is being recorded. The recording, along with the PowerPoint presentation slides, will be available on NASHBA's website, along with MHA's website. We will also send it out via email when both presentations are done. Today's audio is being broadcasted through your computer speakers, and your lines will be muted throughout the duration of the event. Should you need technical assistance or have any questions or comments for the presenters, please type them in the questions, comments, and chat pod, and we will get to as many questions as we can today. Tomorrow will be a part 2. We will be continuing the conversation in a more intimate setting. You'll be able to ask your questions and communicate more comprehensively with both presenters tomorrow from 2 to 3 p.m. via Zoom. The registration link will be available throughout the presentation for you to register for tomorrow. It'll also be available during the evaluation at the end of the presentation. I will now turn it over to Teresa Nguyen, Chief Program Officer at Mental Health America, and she will introduce our today's presenters. Teresa.
Hi, everyone. I hope you all can hear me. Thank you so much, Kelly, for having us here. I want to introduce our 2 speakers today. We are going to be joined by Dr. Plummer and Shani Banks. Dr. Plummer is, as a leading professional in the mental health field, Dr. Plummer is committed to improving the lifestyles of others through the aspects of mental health and character development. A United States military veteran and the CEO and clinical director of Onyx Therapy Group, an organization she founded in 2013, Dr. Plummer has over 15 years of experience working with a multitude of clients and specializing in the care of young women, the Black community, and members of the LGBTQ+ community. Grounded in the values of integrity and awareness, Dr. Plummer believes that emotional, spiritual, and cultural healing is attainable for all. Shani Banks is our second presenter, and Shani Banks is a Black American Muslim, a mental health counselor, and a practitioner of faith-based psychosomatic and expressive art therapies. Shani is the founder of Holistic Muslim Healing, the only organization dedicated to serving American Muslims through expressive art therapies and Islamic spirituality. Shani has been recognized for her work with Holistic Muslim Healing by the Association of Creativity in Counseling, the National Board of Certified Counselors, and the Chi Sigma Iota Professional Counseling Society. For today's presentation, I'm going to go quickly over the learning objectives. What we will be addressing today is what trauma recovery consists of, and the values of faith and spirituality-based approaches for individuals with serious mental illness, what the best practices are for inquiring about a trauma survivor's relationship with spirituality and integrating their beliefs into treatment and healing, and finally incorporating Islamic faith and spirituality into trauma work with the Black Muslim American population. So at this point, I want to thank everyone. I'm going to advance the slide and pass the microphone to Dr. Plummer, who will kick us off with the first part of our presentation. Thank you, Dr. Plummer.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you so much for your introduction. I'm so excited to see everyone checking in. I see California and Oregon, and I saw someone from Nigeria. I initially wanted to say good afternoon because I am here in DC, but I see that we are all over the world. So good day to you all, and I'm so excited to be working with you. As mentioned, I am Dr. LaNail Plummer, the CEO of Onyx Therapy Group, which is a mental health company headquartered in Washington, D.C., with footprints in 4 states, with a huge focus on working in the Black community and the LGBTQ community as well. In addition to my work and leadership as a CEO, I get to be an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University and extend my research on mental health and culture. I'm also the mother of 2 children, one who will be going to college in the fall, and another who will stay home with me and is currently texting me asking for permission to go outside. And then, of course, I get to be a wife. And in all these roles and in all these titles, you hear me mention that I get to be those things because I do believe that they're part of my spiritual alignment and the gift from our gods. So as we move forward a bit, let's talk about some definitions. I'm going to cover things from a much more general perspective, and then we're going to hear a lot more specificity from our next presenter as well. So in starting with trauma, understanding that I am using the operational definition of trauma as any negative experience or any experience that has had a negative impact on a person's well-being. And the difference between trauma and fear is that the trauma also has a lot to do with the re-experiencing of that particular experience. And that re-experiencing may happen physically, it may happen cognitively or emotionally. And those are that's a bit different from fear. A lot of times right now we hear people using trauma in very layman terms and misusing it without understanding the actual depth of effect that it has on a person's well-being and a person's ability to function. From my clinical experience with 17 years in therapy as a therapist, I also recognize that a lot of the mental health disorders that we identify or that we talk about or diagnose, such as depression and anxiety, are often rooted in a traumatic experience that was not properly labeled. And we can go into that a little bit deeper as we talk about it from a cultural perspective, but understanding that as experiences are passed down to us, whether it's in our discipline or in our education or in just parenting and values, sometimes those experiences are traumatic, but they happen to be part of a culture, the culture of the family, the racial culture or social economic culture. And so they're not labeled properly as trauma, they're just labeled as experiences. And because of that, we have the emergence of other disorders like depression and anxiety that show up a bit more frequently. But my question becomes, what happens if we're able to actually address trauma, if we're actually able to call it what it is and treat that as opposed to treating some of the symptoms that may manifest themselves as a different type of mental health disorder. Also, in talking about generational trauma, understanding that that trauma can be passed down, like I mentioned a second ago, from experiences, learned behaviors that happen. But there's also some research that was done a few years ago on folks who have survived the Holocaust, and new research is now emerging around slavery in terms of how this trauma affects cell development, and if our cells are passed down and our genetic codes are passed down from generation to generation, is there an actual genetic connection to trauma? So is it more than learned and lived experiences? Is the trauma rooted in our cells and how they present themselves as we continue to grow? So in the end, you'll see some resources and references in those articles pertaining to generational trauma from a cellular perspective are included in there as well. Here, I'm also talking about grief. And so understanding that grief, in again, most layman's terms, we think about grief in terms of a death connected to a physical loss, but also understanding that it's important for grief to be connected to loss in general. And so that could be the loss of a dream. That could be a loss of a relationship. That could be a loss of a job. That could be a loss of a sense of own identity. And so it's more than just a physical loss. It is any type of loss that has an effect on our life. We also must understand that in all positive experiences, there's usually a slight connection of grief and loss there too. Even when we have, say, a positive experience such as having a child, we also lose a sense of who we were before that child was born. So it's important to also think about what grief and loss looks like, even in positive and happy moments. I bring this forth because a lot of times I recognize that in the work that I get to do, especially with couples, that the traumatic experience could also be a positive experience, such as the birth of a child. I recognize that with a lot of couples, they start to experience a lot of challenges in their relationship when something positive happens, because there's also a shift in what was once before too. So thinking about grief and loss in a more comprehensive and universal perspective, as opposed to just physical loss. That's important because loss could be traumatic as well. The other element we have here is adverse childhood experiences, and those experiences happen generally before the age of 18, but they become definitive in some of the mental health disorders that we see that emerge and have a strong connection to trauma. So in brief, listing out those adverse childhood experiences include when children, through their connections with their families and caregivers or systems that they are part of, are experiencing economic hardships such as poverty, verbal abuse, which is sometimes hard to identify, but it is the pervasive and excessive negative language that is used around them. So not just yelling, but it's the word choice as well. Physical abuse, divorce and separation. And if I pause just for a second, divorce and separation is traumatic more because of the lack of continuity and the lack of clear understanding. So it kind of presents as a little bit of anxiety in children that is unaddressed, generally because adults around them are trying to readjust themselves for their loss and separation and not putting as much attention on what the child is experiencing emotionally. Divorce and separation also tends to have a very strongly American-rooted kind of experience, and I would like us to expound upon divorce and separation to also just include a lack of continuity in general. Many children are not being born into homes of which their parents are married, and so divorce may not be part of their lived experience, but the lack of continuity may be part of their lived experience, in that one of their caretakers may leave or one of their caretakers may move somewhere else. And those caretakers may not be their biological parents, but maybe people that have supported them in their raising and rearing. Going back to listing those adverse childhood experiences, we also have mental illness of a family member that lives in the home. And that's important too, because we all understand that when there is a mental illness present, foundations tend to be a little unstable and shaky. And so subsequently, children don't necessarily know how to move properly because there's not a stable ground. Recognizing also that mental illness may not be diagnosed, or the language may not be consistent in all cultural backgrounds. So a parent or a grandparent may be suffering or dealing with anxiety, but the family doesn't necessarily call it that, and it hasn't been diagnosed that way. The illness is still there. The effect is still there. The adverse childhood experience is still there. It just hasn't been labeled. So when we're thinking about asking our clients about their adverse childhood experiences, we also need to describe it in examples and scenarios, and not just based on the definition terms in the DSM or the ICD. Incarceration is also an adverse childhood experience. So if one of their parents or caregivers or family members has been incarcerated, it is considered an ACE. And then I'd like to add trauma in neighborhoods, communities, education, and healthcare systems. When adverse childhood experiences were starting to be defined for us and emerging into the field, it didn't necessarily include that that some of us are having traumatic experiences or adverse childhood experiences in our education systems where we are being mislabeled, where a disorder may be present, but it's called acting out instead, or a child is getting suspended for behaviors that are actually connected to a mental health disorder, which would be unfair, right? Because we would never suspend a child for a physical illness, so why for a mental health? But our healthcare and education systems also become the foundation for adverse childhood experiences as well. So as we expand on this experience with ourselves today, let us also think about how we can push the field to be more comprehensive in some of the experiences that are listed. When we think about trauma, specifically in relation to the DSM, and understanding again that there are some cultural elements that are missing from the DSM, but in each version it gets to get better and more inclusive. But we also often think about trauma through a few particular disorders and diagnoses. Thinking specifically about the trauma-based ones, we have acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. Oftentimes we think about PTSD first. That's a term that we've been using a lot more frequently, starting with our veterans and with our first responders and policing and fire departments and such. But we're also starting to see a lot of research coming out on PTSD when it comes to race, or PTSD when it comes to gender, or PTSD as it aligns with sexual identity as well and orientation. But prior to PTSD, prior to the actual experience of PTSD, we have acute stress disorder, and that is happening right at the time of the onset of the event. So generally, if we can identify the stress disorder, excuse me, I'm having some tech issues here. But if we can identify the acute stress disorder as a traumatic experience early on, it is less likely to form into PTSD. So we want to make sure that as soon as we understand that something traumatic has happened with ourselves or with a client, instead of trying to mask it or think that we can handle it on our own, we need to be able to make sure that we are actually addressing the trauma. I'm going to pause for a second. I see some of the chat is saying that they cannot hear me. Is anyone able to hear me? Kelly or Bailey?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. All right, just making sure. All right, thank you. So I've mentioned acute stress disorder because it's often underdiagnosed, but it happens before PTSD. So a client generally cannot experience PTSD without having first experienced acute stress disorder, which means that we are underdiagnosing ASD but overdiagnosing PTSD. So it's important, again, for us to put more emphasis on that acute stress disorder as it relates to trauma, because it prevents the cementing of PTSD, which is a bit harder to address. Next, we move on to major depressive disorder, which I think we're all pretty familiar with, so I won't spend too much time there. But I wanted to highlight dysthymia, which is also one of the depressive disorders that is pervasive and long-lasting. And at some point, it starts to seem as if it's part of a person's personality. They always seem sad, or they always seem down, or they have a melancholic kind of perspective on life. And we just say, well, that's just who that person is. Oh, LaNail is just always that way, as opposed to recognizing that it may actually be dysthymia, and it may actually have a connection to trauma as well. So asking our clients during intake and throughout sessions about how people often describe them is going to be important for them to understand themselves as well. Of course, we have generalized anxiety disorder, but I also want to highlight social anxiety as it pertains to trauma too, generally because we recognize that between the anxieties, the different anxiety disorders, social anxiety is usually a response to something. It is a to a social experience that was misunderstood, or the response to not having the resources that were needed to properly engage. So recognizing that even social anxiety may have a root in trauma as well. And then lastly, the personality disorders, whether it's histrionic personality disorder, which is largely rooted in attention-seeking behaviors, which is a connection to attachment, or avoidant personality disorder, which is largely rooted in feelings of inadequacy, or even borderline personality disorder, which has a reflection on instability in relationships, self-image, impulsivity, and feelings of abandonment. I mentioned of the personality disorders, I mentioned these particularly because we recognize that our minority communities in the United States, including our Black and Brown communities, are oftentimes overdiagnosed in personality disorders. They're diagnosed 3 to 4 times more likely in personality disorders and not necessarily in the traumatic disorders. And again, I'm making the connection that many of these personality disorders have a root in trauma, and the diagnosis focuses on the personality disorder as opposed to the trauma. That's kind of like treating the leaf of a tree versus treating the roots, right? So we need to pay more attention to what those roots are that are largely rooted in trauma. Even if we don't necessarily call it trauma for ourselves, or we don't understand it as trauma, it could still be traumatic and have an experience for the client. As we move on, let us talk a bit about spirituality, which is why one of the main reasons we are here today. I'm going to advance my slide. So I think about spirituality in terms of our definitions here. Well, first, the purpose. The purpose of spirituality is that it's part of our human development. It's essential for our opportunity to explore ourselves, not just in counseling, but to explore ourselves generally. Think about spirituality as a part of who we are, just like our thoughts are part of who we are, and our feelings are part of who we are. Our physical language is also part of who we are, and our spirituality is a part of who we are. But we also recognize that oftentimes many people misunderstand spirituality as religion, or they fall away from spirituality because they're not quite sure about that part of their development, and so subsequently they disassociate from their spirit. Here we have a survey mentioning to us that counselors should be familiar with the competencies of spirituality and religious issues as well, the theories connected to spiritual development, and the assessment tools connected to spirituality, as well as interventions. This is important because like many of us, when we were in our graduate programs, we learned about theories related to human development and maybe even had a class on it. Or we learned theories that were specifically related to psychology and our big theories, right? Like our psychodynamic or our cognitive or behavioral. And we maybe even took specialty classes like CBT, and we learned about the theories that were connected to those classes and the assessments for those as well. But here we have a survey saying that we are also ethically held to the standard of knowing the theories that are connected to spiritual development and the assessment tools connected to spirituality and the interventions connected to spirituality as well. It is actually part of our multiculturalism because spirit is part of culture as well. So it's important that we highlight the need to understand more about spirituality. As we go into some of the definitions, we're thinking about the capacity. Spirituality is that capacity and tendency that is innate and unique to all people. And it is largely connected to how we see, process, experience, and give love and meaning, peace, hope, connectedness, compassion, wellness, and wholeness, those elements are connected to spirituality. That is part of spirituality. And again, making sure that we're separating spirituality from religion, which we are here defining as an organized system of beliefs and rituals associated with an institutional structure. So before, when we're thinking about spirituality, we're thinking about characteristics and experiences, again, love and meaning and peace, and religion being an organized system. So while spirituality can be part of religion, it is not, they are not synonymous with each other. And then using the term of meaning of life, and that is the meaning that goes beyond the material experience. So that is who we are and how we are and how we can be and how we place meaning on the experiences. You know, in most simplest terms, are we glass half full? Are we glass half empty? Do we see a rainy day and think about rejuvenation, or do we see a rainy day and think about something that is not as positive? How do we find that meaning in life? And all of those are connected, again, to spirituality. So the importance of spirituality, when we think about it from a clinical perspective, is that a lot of our clients they have spirituality as part of their identity. Some may call it religion, and again, it's important for us as clinicians to separate the two for them, but also recognizing that it is a part of who they are, and it's important that we ask clients to bring their full selves forward. So just like we ask them in intake about a range of topics, we must also ask about their spirituality and how spirituality impacts their life. How does it impact their quality of life? How does it impact their personal adjustment? How does it even impact their psychological symptoms? That point there is interesting too when I've done some research in the past thinking about how many times people will call a mental health illness a demon or something that is demonic or from the devil or something like that. That kind of perspective falls into mental health diagnosis and spirituality, because a client may not necessarily see that that their mental health disorder is something that could be physical or chemical for them, but rather something that is spiritual and has to be addressed in those ways too. So we only think about it from a very compartmentalized clinical perspective. We miss out on the fullness of who our client is and how they see themselves and what their worldview and identity is. There's also a very strong association between one's personal value system and beliefs, as well as, again, how they see purpose and meaning in their lives. Just a couple key points here for spirituality. When we're incorporating spirituality in counseling, it provides for cultural stability, it provides for continuity, it provides for mental health, positive mental health outcomes, because again, the client is able and comfortable and safe to bring forth 100% who they are, as opposed to just segments and compartments of who they are. It allows for the client to, it allows for us and the client to use spirituality as an agent of change for them, especially when we think about it in terms of their protective factors. And it also allows for that therapeutic alliance to be presented. You know, again, if we're thinking about spirituality as part of who we are, our clients need to bring their fullness into the sessions. And when they don't bring their fullness into the sessions, we can't actually make all of the treatment goals and the outcomes that we have created with and for our clients. We also recognize through this particular research that if a client is not able to bring forth their full worldview and their full experiences, they often feel misinterpreted, misunderstood, and that causes a rift in the therapeutic relationship as well. So clients, based off of the next research, are actually asking for and welcoming and expecting for us to incorporate spirituality into their practices, into their sessions. And again, separating spirituality from religion, especially for clients who need that. in working with clients in the LGBTQ community, I often find that I have to be extremely explicit on the differences between spirituality and religion, especially because historically many religious bodies have oppressed and discriminated against those who have been part of the LGBTQ community. So those folks are also losing and missing part of their spiritual identity because they've overemphasized the connection to religion. So making sure that we separate those for our clients, give them these operational definitions that you all have today, or even the ones that you create for yourselves, so that they can connect with spirit and have the fullest experience in therapy as well. Going back to a service, just for a brief second, here are some of the competencies explicitly that a cervic outlines for us as clinicians working with clients. So I'll give you a second just to read and browse those. I love to see the chat moving. I love the discussion here. Perfect. Let's talk for a second about protective factors, how spirituality and mental health is both aligned with protective factors and coping mechanisms. I want to distinguish here between the two of protective factors and coping mechanisms, because we have a lot of our clients and a lot of folks that are outside of the mental health community overusing the term coping mechanism. But the coping happens after an incident or a trigger has occurred. It's how you deal with an aftermath. But as clinicians, providers, we also want to encourage our clients to start thinking about what are their protective factors. What do you do before an incident happens? What do you do before a trigger occurs? What do you do before there's a sensitivity? Also recognizing that trigger is associated with trauma, and sensitivities happen in just general life. We are sensitive to certain things, but it doesn't mean that it's a trigger. It doesn't mean that it has an association to trauma. It just means that we're sensitive about that. Nonetheless, let's talk about these protective factors. So protective factors are designed to protect us from an emotional and mental harm. It is designed to protect us from overthinking or protect us from triggering responses. So think about it as a fence, right, in front of our homes. You have a fence to protect yourself from intruders. Coping mechanisms are like having a bat. It's what you do once an intruder comes in. It's how you respond after something has happened. So we have to start incorporating more protective factors and that type of language into our work with clients, so that they understand that there's elements of prevention that can happen, especially if they have a history of trauma. So some examples of protective factors, these are the things that we do every day, or we do them consistently. We consistently assess them for wear and tear and make sure that our protective factors are visible. Again, think of a fence. So some examples of that are meditation, prayer, devotionals, songs, increased self-awareness activities. That may mean journal prompts in the mornings or afternoon. Setting aside time for ourselves, like truly setting aside time for ourselves to just be and connect, and not necessarily responding to people, but just connecting with the essence of who we are. Protective factors could include our hobbies, our mantras, our quiet space. It could also include those nostalgic memories, maybe going through our pictures in our phone and thinking about experiences that we've had that have been so beautiful and positive, and exercising. Those are also protective factors. Again, coping mechanisms, especially as we think about it in terms of trauma and religion, or excuse me, trauma and spirituality, happen after we have been triggered. And so what do we do after that? These coping mechanisms should be something that is familiar to us and that we can handle, but that we use less frequently, but they allow us to regain safety. So remember, your protective factors are happening frequently, consistently, and they're visible. Your coping mechanisms happen as needed and less frequently. If we find that we're using our coping mechanisms more frequently, then we have to switch a little bit and put a little bit more emphasis on our protective and preventative factors. So some of our coping mechanisms may include, on the day of a particular trigger, going to bed early that day, or having an intense physical exercise and workout, like running hard or lifting more weight. It may include crying on purpose and with sound. It may also include conversations with a confidant. So again, distinguishing between protective factors and coping mechanisms, all as it connects to spirituality. So some of the things that we can do is to connect with our source daily. Again, these are our protective factors here. Connecting with our source daily. That may mean worshiping. That may mean daily devotionals. That may mean podcasts. That may mean meditation. I know that when I'm walking my puppy, he's not a puppy much anymore, but when I'm walking him, that's my time to look out at nature and to be grateful for what I see around me, which is, in my mind, God's art and a gift that he gives to us through nature. So slowing down and connecting with source. It also means increased self-awareness. So paying attention to how we are feeling every day. Where are we feeling tight? Where is our clients feeling tight? Asking them about that and asking them about their appreciation language. How do they show appreciation and how do they get appreciation? Giving ourselves grace. For those that are religious, they say that even God rested, right? On that seventh day, that Sabbath, even God rested, even God gave grace to himself. And so wouldn't it be appropriate to give that same grace to ourselves as a protective factor as well, going into a situation and knowing that it may not be perfect. And then again, giving ourselves mercy after that has happened, and that would be a coping mechanism, because again, protective factors before and preventative, and protective factors before and preventative, and coping is an aftermath. So having understanding that in our processes of spirituality, especially with trauma recovery, that there are going to be moments of regression. There are going to be moments in which things, we think we're right on the right track, and we are. And then something happens and we feel extremely overwhelmed, and that is where regression comes in or can seep in. And subsequently, helping our clients to accept that to be a reality, accepting that that will happen. And it does not mean that they are not on the right track. Instead, it means that it is a normal part, a normal process of recovery. Again, I love the chat. You guys are making some great points in there. Doing nothing, so allowing ourselves to just recharge by doing nothing, by just sitting, by just breathing, by just looking outside. Reconnecting with our childhood experiences are also great ways that we can experience that trauma recovery, the positive experiences. For many of my clients, I have them bringing in coloring sheets, or I may have coloring sheets, and we may even watch a few clips of a cartoon, He-Man and She-Ra, or whatever the cartoons of our generations may be, but having them reconnect with some of those positive past childhood experiences also allows for this reconciliation and this recovery and this healing. Using our hands, having that eye-hand breathing coordination is also important because it allows for a pure and full synergetic flow within our body. Our eyes and our hands and our breathing opens up particular pathways that allow for our nerves to switch and change a little bit. I'm sure many of us are trained on neuroplasticity, but understanding that in order to even have that flexibility in our brains, we have to be making adjustments in the other ways that we experience and sense life. So the ways we see and hear and taste and all of those things have an effect on the neuroplasticity. So when we are addressing trauma, we have to do it through our senses, because the traumatic experience was experienced through the senses. We saw something, we heard something, we felt something, and that is how the trauma occurred. And so in order to restructure that and to recover from that, we must also use those sensory elements to restructure. Again, making sure that when we have been triggered, that we take the space that we need. And alone time is good. Oftentimes we want to go right into, I need to address this right away because we're triggered and we're anxious and we want to take away that anxiety and that pain and that discomfort and remove the memory of that we just had and the re-experience. But it's important to take a little bit of space in doing that and to also being able to communicate with folks through a six-step communication process or a four-step problem-solving process, and to remain clear-headed when we are also triggered. That means when we have been triggered, when our clients have been triggered, we ask them to refrain from drinking because we know that alcohol can serve as a depressant and cause more issues in the moment of that trigger. And we also ask them to refrain from eating spicy food because we know that our dopamine and our dopamine and serotonin are stored in our gut and not in our brain. So it's released from our gut and goes to our brain. So if we're eating spicy food, our body is trying to process the spiciness, and it actually suppresses the release of dopamine and serotonin. So here's just an example I made mention just a second ago of that six-step communication process and that four-step problem-solving process. So here it is laid out, just so you can have an example of it. And then we think, of course, because we are clinicians, of how we address trauma recovery through therapy. So when we're thinking about, and I'm sure, again, thinking about ourselves as clinicians, and we have family members that come to us, our friends that come to us, and they say, I have trauma, and subsequently they need help. When that happens with me, I really encourage the person, and I work with them and walk with them as we find a therapist that has a specialization in their particular type of trauma. All trauma is not universal. So just like we mentioned, one second, yes, I see that. I'll pause just a second and go back to the previous slide, if I can here. Here we go. There's the previous slide. And I do think that the slides will be made available. Perfect. Right. So making sure that our therapists, the therapists working with our folks that have trauma, are also understanding the special element and unique part of that trauma. So some therapists and clinicians say, I work with all clients with trauma, but they may have only really specialized in working with divorce or separation or a lack of continuity in the home, where my trauma may be a race-based trauma, or my trauma may be a career-based trauma, or a maternal-based trauma, where I may have had a miscarriage, with the different changes happening in our country right now. There may be other elements, and so making sure that the therapist has past experience or is willing to learn about that particular type of trauma, because all trauma cannot be addressed the exact same way, and understanding the cultural competencies and intersections. A couple of theoretical orientations I've found throughout my career has been theoretical in cognitive, theoretical in behavioral, and therapeutic in both CBT, as well as EMDR. Those types of therapies tend to be the best when we're talking about clients with trauma, particularly because of that sensory connection, the behavioral element that is connected to it as well. Homework, so books, workbooks, podcasts, songs, things that they could do independently outside of our work, as well as changing the environment when it's necessary. So creating new communities. Sometimes people stay in environments because they've been there for so long, or because these people really know me, but they're actually triggering the trauma. So encouraging our clients to make the steps and to guide them as needed in creating the environments that allow for them to experience recovery and to sustain their recovery, especially as we incorporate faith and spirituality. So here are some of the references that I've talked about and incorporated. And again, I believe you all will have access to the PowerPoint, so you can be able to research these particular peer-reviewed articles. And so there are several that are here. And then you also have access to me after this presentation, and especially tomorrow, to ask further questions around trauma and spirituality in the most comprehensive, I guess, way. So here's some ways that you can stay in touch with me. And I am passing the baton to our next presenter. So thank you so much for spending that last 40 minutes or so with me. And I look forward to seeing you all again, or hearing from you all again tomorrow. So be sure to register for the event tomorrow as well. And I'll be in the chat answering some of the questions too. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shani Banks. I am going to be presenting next on the topic of Black Muslim trauma and fostering post-traumatic growth for this population. And I'm hopeful that what we just learned from Dr. Plummer will inform a lot of what we're going to dive in and discuss right now. Alrighty. So just starting off with some positioning here. As I shared, my name is Shani Banks. My pronouns are she and her. I'm a Black Muslim woman and a mental health counselor in Maryland. I incorporate clinical mental health care with expressive arts, movement, and spirituality. And as was mentioned at the beginning, I'm the founder at Holistic Muslim Healing, which is the organization dedicated to providing expressive arts therapies to Muslim American communities. Alrighty. All right, so our objectives for today, we are going to hopefully gain some awareness about the heritages, values, beliefs, and acculturative experiences of certain Black Muslims. We're going to be focusing on the United States and the experience of Black Muslim communities in the U.S. We're going to work to understand the ways in which trauma and intersectional invisibility affect Black Muslim mental health. We're going to talk a little bit about Islamic spirituality, and we're actually going to map that onto post-traumatic growth for Black Muslim mental health. And then we'll, at the end, just talk a little bit about a few tools and resources that you can refer to in your work or your own personal growth for working with this population. All right, we got everybody. So I wanted to start off discussing Black Muslim identity, and I included just a few photos here of Black Muslim individuals. Some of them, may be more familiar than others, and I just wanted us to take a few seconds here just to recognize the contributions of Black Muslims to U.S. history. So we have photos here of politicians and policymakers, of civil rights advocates, Olympians, and musicians. So this is obviously by no means an exhaustive list, but hopefully just a reminder of the fact that Black Muslims are here, that Black Muslims have been here, and exist in every facet of American life and work. Alrighty. So just continuing here to look at Black Muslim identity. I just stated that Black Muslims have been here, and that's true. We know that Black Muslims have been here for centuries, with potentially up to 20% of enslaved Africans in the United States identifying as Muslim. In more recent history, the Nation of Islam, which is often considered a kind of offshoot of Orthodox Islam, rose to prominence amongst African American populations in the early 1900s. And while some, Black Muslims may continue to identify with the nation today, really a majority of Black Muslims do identify with Orthodox Islam, specifically Sunni Islam. And then there's, again, that 27% there with no denomination. So although we are talking about one population here of Black Muslims in the U.S., I do want us to remember as we talk that Black Muslims are an incredibly diverse group that range across ethnicity, that range across levels of citizenship, ability and sexuality, as we all do, presentation, religious adherence, and then spirituality as well. All right, so just a quick definition here. Black Muslims are any Muslims who identify as Black. So folks might be of different ancestry. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're talking about folks who are ancestors of previously enslaved Africans in the United States. People who might be from anywhere, of different ethnicity, of different phenotype, think hair type or nose shape. Folks might be of different color, whether they're lighter or darker skinned. When we think of Black Americans in general, we know that Black Americans actually largely identify as Christian, and only 2% of Black Americans identify as Muslim, so a pretty small percentage there. But on the flip side, Black Americans, or Black Muslims really, make up a substantial 20% of the general United States Muslim population. So most of the U.S.-born Muslims are Black or African American, and half of all Black Muslims are actually converts to Islam. So I know that's kind of like a lot of statistics, a lot of numbers there. And the reason that I wanted to talk about this and discuss Black Muslim identity generally is that so we can lay the foundation of who we're talking about today. So it's important that we take this kind of holistic view of the population before we dive into discussing this population's trauma. And that's not, just to be culturally sensitive, which we know, of course, is important, but it's also to make sure that we're assuming a strengths-based perspective and making sure that we're seeing a whole community that's imbued with histories and rich cultures and important contributions that we bring into our awareness as we look into some of the areas of trauma and some of the areas of struggle within this community. All right, there we are. Okay. So looking a little bit at Black Muslim trauma, Black Muslims sit at a very particular cross-section in American society where they receive both anti-Black racism and anti-Muslim discrimination or Islamophobia. This phenomenon of being associated with two or more marginalized groups is called invisible intersectionality. And it's considered invisible because this particular intersection of discrimination isn't widely discussed or considered as a specified area of marginalization. In fact, when we talk about these groups, when we talk about Black populations, and we talk about Muslim populations, we often speak about them as if they are intrinsically, separate groups, whereas Black Muslims actually receive the discrimination of both without the targeted outreach and advocacy of either. So some of the research actually shows that Black Muslims self-report feeling more racial discrimination than is self-reported by all other Black Americans, regardless of religious affiliation. So perceiving a higher level of racial discrimination than any other Black Americans. And then in addition to that, Black Muslims similarly perceive more anti-Muslim discrimination or perceive more Islamophobia than any other group of Muslims, regardless of race or ethnicity. So not only are Black Muslims receiving the trauma of discrimination within both of these identities, but Black Muslims also perceive a greater level of racial trauma and of religious trauma than their racial and religious counterparts. Okay, so in 2017, there was this hashtag and this campaign that was floating around, and that was called hashtag Being Black and Muslim, where Black Muslims were voicing some of the very particular forms of discrimination that they face on a day-to-day basis. And so this photo here on the left is from a portrait series that was done where the artist paired some of the tweets from hashtag Being Black and Muslim with portraits of Black Muslims. And so in this tweet, someone said that being Black and Muslim means that you are the largest group of American Muslims, but you are the last to be asked to speak on Islam. So many of the tweets that we saw actually reflect intersectional invisibility in this way. So for the Black Muslim community, being Muslim means that this group is often viewed as a non-prototypical members of the Black community, right? Almost being seen as fringe or illegitimate or lesser members of the Black community. So yeah, you're not really Black, you're kind of like a different kind of Black, right? And then similarly, being Black means that Black Muslims tend to be erased from the general conception of American Muslims, being seen as a predominantly Arab or South Asian immigrant religious group, which we know is not the case. Black Muslims, then are also dually criminalized through racialized policing, mass incarceration, CVE programs, and Islamophobia, and also face racism in religious spaces. So there's this idea of like, well, you're not really Black, and you're not Muslim, right? But are also receiving a lot of the criminalization and the discrimination from both of these communities. And then additionally, because of this intersectional invisibility, Black Muslims are also decentered from the fight against Islamophobia in non-Muslim liberal discourse. And so what this means is that when there is advocacy that aims to center Muslim voices and experiences and actually combat Islamophobia, it is often complicit in the erasure of Black Muslim identity and upholds the perception of American Muslims as exclusively Arab or South Asian. And so this is what this particular person is speaking to when they note that despite being the largest group of American Muslims, they are the last to be asked to represent Islam. Alrighty. Okay, so what does all of this mean for Black Muslim mental health? Given the recent, albeit limited research, we know that the dual marginalization of Black Muslims has contributed to Black Muslims experiencing higher rates of physical, emotional, racial, and intergenerational trauma. So, now at this point, as mental health professionals, we might be thinking, okay, this is where we come in, and it absolutely is. If we remember from one of the earlier slides, Black Muslims are more likely than Muslims of any other race or ethnicity to perceive religious discrimination. And that heightened perception of religious discrimination is actually associated with depression. It's associated with anxiety, paranoia, and substance use. So those are just some of the known effects of Islamophobia. Then separately from that, anti-Blackness, which again is perceived at higher levels for Black Muslims, leads to lower levels of overall life satisfaction and happiness. So this unfortunately is a pretty bleak picture of Black Muslim mental health. And we have a whole population of folks here who are receiving the brunt of some of the most violent racial and religious discrimination, but feel totally invisible in their trauma. And so I promise, it's not going to be sad the entire time. We're going to get into how we can help make this better and how we can use spirituality to do that. Okay. So I do want to just take a pause here because we just talked about a lot of heavy themes. And I want us to make sure that we are taking care of ourselves even as we're in work mode right now. So I'm using this activity from my grandmother's hands, and some of you may be familiar with this book. And if not, I highly recommend that you give it a read. It's a book about racialized trauma and healing, so it's very appropriate for our discussion thus far. But I'd like us to do an exercise today called belly breathing. Breathing for me is a very spiritual exercise, and so I want to invite all of us to practice it today. The purpose of this particular exercise is just to settle our bodies, especially if you're feeling, particularly charged or activated by any of our discussion thus far. And so I'd like everyone to participate, and I will guide us through this. If you feel comfortable, I want to invite you to close your eyes here, and you might firmly plant your feet on the ground if you're sitting in a chair and you are able to, and just begin to deepen your breath here. Maybe breathing in through your nose and breathing out through your nose. Maybe taking a deep inhale in, seeing if you can expand your stomach like a balloon. And then on your exhale, can you bring your stomach in towards your spine? Let it go. Inhale, big, full belly breath. Exhale, let it go. You might see if you can maintain these deep belly breaths. Maybe a few more on your own, breathing in and out. Maybe allowing your shoulders to slide away from your ears as you breathe. Maybe let your next inhale be the deepest inhale you've taken all day long. And exhale, let it go. Your eyes are closed. I invite you to open your eyes here. Maybe take any movement that you might need. Maybe take a minute to notice what you're experiencing in your body. Hopefully we're able to center our bodies a little bit. Hopefully we were able to feel or experience a little bit of spirituality today through breathing together. And we're ready to kind of hop back into talking about this topic. Moving this along. All right. So jumping back in here, we looked at some of the major mental health issues faced by Black Muslims due to invisible intersectionality. And so now we'll just take a look at what help seeking looks like for this population. Right off the bat, Black Muslims are often late to seeking treatment for mental health issues. Researchers have outlined this hierarchy of help seeking in Muslim American communities, which includes Black Muslims. So on that hierarchy, Black Muslims will typically seek help from family members first. So we have family members at the very top, and then may seek out help from community members, religious leaders, and healers. So that's our second row. So that's the second line of defense there, kind of, that Black Muslims will go to. From there, Black Muslims might seek help from their primary care provider. And then lastly, after that, Black Muslims will meet with a mental health professional. So one of the main deterrents for seeking help from a mental health professional is actually stereotype threat. So this fear that if a Black Muslim who is experiencing mental health issues meets with a professional, that professional will make assumptions about the individual's racial or religious community based on that individual's presentation. So for example, there's a case study about a Black Muslim woman who was the victim of domestic violence by her Black Muslim husband. And she feared that by seeking help, her helper would feel validated in the stereotype that Muslim men oppress women, or that Black men are violent. And she was hesitant because of that reason. So overall, Muslims generally perceive that biomedical models of mental health as being congruent with their religious and spiritual beliefs and don't actually perceive conflict between the two. And so the reason I want to include that point and make that point clear here is just to really highlight how much of the gap in service for this population is owed to what is essentially an issue of cultural competency rather than cultural or religious difference. So this gap in help seeking is one that I think that we should actually feel pretty optimistic about being able to close, because it relies on us being able to continue to build and grow our own cultural competence and cultural sensitivity. And so we'll actually do an exercise shortly on being able to kind of widen our own awareness. Okay. So I first want to just look at a few recommendations for what we can do to improve mental health outcomes for Black Muslim populations. So the first is really preventative. We want to make sure that we can get in, before stage 4, which is the motto here on the slide. But for Black American communities, this means essentially being able to provide early mental health education that is targeted to and for this community. So it's a way of making a community that feels invisible visible by centering this community's specific needs and voices. And so you can do this by firstly doing some personal or organizational work and identifying where your mental health outreach can better call in Black Muslim communities. And so one way of doing this could be by partnering with Black Muslim individuals and organizations that are in your area and seeing how you might work together for mental health education and outreach. My second suggestion is to establish safe environments for Black Muslim healing. So this means letting Black Muslim communities and individuals let them know that you are wanting, to be a safe space for them specifically. And so we can actually help reduce the stereotype threat that's really hindering help seeking by making sure that we are validating Black Muslims' lived experience in areas of acculturation, in areas of power, of privilege, and heritage. So this might look different depending on your own personal or organizational outreach practices and communication. And then lastly, I just want to invite all of us to increase our familiarity with culturally and spiritually authentic interventions. And so we're going to take a look at some of those interventions next. But this means, gaining a better understanding of Black Muslim cultures and spirituality. So highlighting, right, rather than understating cultural and spirituality in your diversity work and confronting your own personal biases and assumptions. Okay. So that leads us right into this exercise, confronting our own personal biases and assumptions regarding Black Muslim identity. I'd like for us to walk through each of these questions, and I invite you to just take some time with yourself to consider not only your responses to the questions, but also your reactions that you have to these questions. So what do these questions bring up for you? Right, what emotions or bodily sensations do you notice arising? Let's see if we can examine our awareness of Black Muslim identity from a perspective of compassion rather than self-judgment. And so I'll read through these and I invite you to just kind of engage with them personally. The first question here is, what are my beliefs about Islam as a religion? How do I feel when I hear Black Lives Matter? How suspicious am I of Muslims being, knowing, or aiding terrorists? What are the social, historical, and political facts that started the BLM movement? What are my views about Islam? Negative, positive, or neutral? What are my reactions, my thoughts and feelings to the BLM movement? And then lastly, what are my reactions to watching videos of police brutality against Black men, Black women, and Black children? So that's a lot. And I know that that's not, enough time to kind of sit and work through each of these questions. But I'm hopeful that these questions help to at least begin to open up some growth areas that you can continue to engage with, and that you can continue to engage that with yourself or with your organization with compassion, remembering to approach these questions with compassion rather than a sense of self-judgment or criticism, and really working for the sake of the betterment of our society as a whole and our own cultural competency. All right, so we will jump ahead. All right. The notion of struggle is something that has been deeply ingrained in Black American communities, and you cannot adequately struggle unless you have a strong sense of spirituality with you. This is a quote by Sheikh Khalil Abdul-Rashid, who is Black and Muslim and is a Muslim chaplain at Harvard. And he's speaking to the racial trauma experienced by Black people throughout the Americas and the role that spirituality has played and continues to play as a solve for Black Americans, and that includes Black Muslims. So we're going to next take a look at what that healing sense of spirituality looks like for Black Muslims and how Black Muslim spirituality really plays a protective role in Black Muslim trauma. All right. So Sheikh Abdul-Rashid, who we heard the quote from before, has outlined what he calls the Black Muslim litany. And these are the 6 elements of Islamic spirituality that have served as that protective and healing element for Black Muslims. And so this is really a compilation of Islamic moral axioms that have historically been important to Black Muslim communities in their expressions of spirituality. So these are not theologically unique to Black individuals, but should be viewed more as elements of spirituality that we want to keep in mind in our mental health work with Black Muslims. And so we'll review each element of the Black Muslim litany, and then we'll actually map the litany onto the necessary elements of post-traumatic growth to really conceptualize this for use as a mental health tool. So the first element of the litany is faith, which refers to belief in a benevolent God and belief in expressions of benevolence, of mercy, and of compassion as spiritual proximity to the divine. The second element that we have here as part of the Black Muslim litany is life, which includes both a respect for and the protection of all living things, plants, animals, and human beings. Third, we have intellect, which refers again to the respect for and preservation of intellect. So practically speaking, this can range from something as simple as treating books with care, right? Like taking care of books. It could be honoring learned individuals, or it could be pursuing education in all of its various forms. And so acknowledging that these things are spiritual in their nature for Black Muslims. Fourth, we have family, referring to the rights and the responsibilities that one owes and one is owed. So honoring ties of kinship is one example here, and then filial piety is another example. Fifth, we have property, which refers both to the right to own property and then also the responsibility to preside over it with care, with humility, and a sense of justice. Lastly, as part of the litany, we have honor and dignity, which again is both assumed and owed and should be justly preserved over every living thing, plants, animals, and human beings. And so immediately, this might not be what we conceptualize of as spirituality, right? But each of these things has spiritual significance within Islam generally, and then for Black Muslims specifically, when we think about this as a litany that's really been protective for Black Muslims throughout history in aiding as a form of spirituality when trauma occurs or when harm occurs. Okay, so these 6 elements will really help us to better understand Black Muslims' perception of spirituality, which can be broadly applicable, for various mental health issues, and should be imbued throughout healing interventions and also within mental health outreach for this population. Okay. All right. So I want to highlight this idea of post-traumatic growth. So as we talk about Black Muslim trauma and the healing nature of spirituality, we're ultimately aiming to help people find post-traumatic growth, right? So it's the positive psychological change that's experienced as a result of the struggle with highly challenging life circumstances. So this idea that, with the right supports, individuals and communities can really thrive after experiencing a traumatic event. So listed here are some of the major elements of post-traumatic growth. We have greater appreciation of life, greater appreciation of strengthening of close relationships, increased compassion and altruism, the identification of new possibilities or purpose in life, greater awareness and utilization of personal strengths, enhanced spiritual development, and creative growth. So these are some of the changes that we expect to see when an individual achieves post-traumatic growth. Alrighty. So we've looked at those elements of post-traumatic growth. We can now map the Black Muslim litany onto those elements. So this map can help us understand how those elements of Black Muslim spirituality can actually help individuals foster post-traumatic growth. So this is essentially a map for how interventions centered on a particular facet of spirituality can lead to healing and growth. So we have faith as the first element of the Black Muslim litany, which really corresponds to spiritual change. And so if you remember, faith is this expression of benevolence, of mercy, and of compassion. And so being able to imbue our mental health outreach and to really imbue our mental health interventions with this spiritual element of faith can correspond with spiritual change as well as compassion and altruism within this population. And so we'll work that same way kind of with the rest of these elements. So the spiritual element of life, which we have next, corresponds with the post-traumatic growth element for an appreciation of life. So life, again, being just really this appreciation for preserving of life, appreciating, preserving, and respecting life in all of its forms. We talked about plants, animals, and human life. And so being able to think of ways of like how we might take that element of life and the preservation of life and really bake that into our interventions that we're using as a form of spirituality and understanding that that can lead to a greater appreciation of life. Right. So next we have a spiritual focus on intellect, which navigates to creative growth. So we can think about that in the sense of personal growth and hobbies. Right? So being able to use intellect in this really importance of preserving intellect as a form of intervention with Black Muslims as a way to foster creative growth and post-traumatic growth. Family as corresponding with relationships to others. And it's also important to remember here the concept of chosen family as well. So we talked a little bit about ties of kinship, one thing we didn't talk about is chosen family, and the idea that in the same way that we talked about intersectional identities, that there are Black Muslims who identify as queer as well, and that their relationships with their born families might not be as solid as their relationships with their chosen families. And so understanding that family can refer as well to chosen families in this sense, and that chosen families can be spiritual. So next we have property as a fifth element of the Black Muslim litany, which corresponds here with new possibilities in life. So, owning property, right, but then also taking stock of what is already owned, what one has in their life, and how that can lead to greater possibilities in life. And then lastly, we have honor relating to personal strength. So really just kind of going back here to self-esteem and being able to build up self-confidence and how honor might play into that as an intervention. So we can really see, this is very brief and very general, but we can see how spirituality, and in this case, particularly and very specifically, Black Muslim spirituality can help us move individuals and communities towards post-traumatic growth and healing. Already. Okay, so we have looked at Black Muslim identity, we've looked at Black Muslim trauma, we have looked at help-seeking behaviors and spirituality. Now I'll just go through a few recommendations for encouraging Black Muslim post-traumatic growth, and those are to provide psychoeducation that's targeted for these communities that we talked about before, being able to highlight spiritual strategies for self and community care. Dr. Plummer gave us some of those earlier, prayer and meditation being a few that are relevant here for Black Muslim populations. Being able to center the voices, the research, and the clinical care of Black Muslim mental health professionals who are out there, who you can collaborate with, that you can call in, that you can center their work is so important. Being able to create safe spaces and engage the narratives of Black Muslims as both legitimate Black people and as legitimate Muslims, being able to validate that narrative. And then lastly, remembering that spirituality can be helpful, but it's not central to every Black Muslim. So Dr. Plummer talked a little bit about religion and spirituality, and so we know that just because someone identifies, right, as religiously Muslim doesn't necessarily mean that all of the elements of Islamic spirituality are going to be relevant or helpful necessarily for that person. So being able to, meet the person where they are, understand what spirituality means for them, understand what religion means to them, and being able to work within that. Okay, and just my last slide here, I wanted to offer a few resources for Black Muslim healing for continued learning. So these are just a few resources that hopefully will give you a little bit more information about this population, about narratives within this population. There are a few tools for healing, for mental health work included here. All of this is free, apart from the DSM, of course, but I invite you to take a look at these and explore and continue to learn and continue to expand your own knowledge of this population and the ways in which you might be able to draw in this population and serve this population. And that is everything that I had today. Thank you so much for your time. I hope that this was helpful. Here's my contact information. And I will be on tomorrow as well if there are any other questions or areas for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Shani and Dr. Plummer, and I want to thank everyone for being here with us today. Tomorrow we will have an awesome part 2 where we will take a deep dive into the questions that were shared today and explore further details on how we support communities through faith and spirituality. I thank you so much again, and thanks SAMHSA for sponsoring us in this presentation. And ask if anybody is still here. We have a a survey at the very end that we will be closing out and you should be seeing. And thank you so much for helping us with that survey. All right, see you soon.